Welcome back to Season 5 of Decision Points. I'm David Makovsky, the Ziegler Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. I'm happy to go on this journey with you. For the first time since the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, Israel's facing 7 active combat fronts, including, of course, Gaza, but also the West Bank, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Iran, and Yemen. This multi-front reality was once the dream of Qasem Soleimani, the former commander of the Al-Quds Force of the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, who was assassinated in 2020 by a U.S. drone strike. Soleimani referred to this as the Ring of Fire, a strategy designed to suffocate Israel by applying pressure on all sides. Today, the Ring of Fire consists of Iranian-backed proxy forces who seek to wage a war of attrition against Israel. In the face of this, the challenge for Israel, the United States, and their allies is not just the military threat posed by these proxies. There's also an important geopolitical layer to Iran's regional influence. Iran's proxy network is far-reaching, with armed groups entrenching themselves into local politics and conflicts across the Middle East. And despite pressure from the U.S. and others, they have proven to be remarkably resilient. From Hezbollah in Lebanon to the Houthis in Yemen, Iran's relationship to these groups are driven by a mix of ideological, strategic, and regional ambitions. Iran's strategy of hollowing out state authority has created a troubling asymmetry in the region, where non-state actors are often stronger than the states themselves, and they operate with impunity. In Lebanon, Hezbollah undermines the legitimacy of the Lebanese government by wielding its own force and dragging the country into conflicts the government didn't initiate or authorize. But as the saying goes, the people who fire the shots call the shots. In Syria, Bashar al-Assad struggles to maintain control over his own territory. This is the axis of misery, where states remain economically weak and politically fractured, and Iran's proxies thrive in the shadows, destabilizing the region further. This all begs the questions: how does Iran maintain control over such a vast network of proxies? What drives their loyalty to Iran's strategic vision? Why are they so resilient? And what is the U.S. and Israeli approach to curbing the influence of these groups? To unpack these questions, I'm joined by 3 experts with decades of experience studying Iran's military and security apparatus. Michael Knights is the Jill and Jay Bernstein Senior Fellow at the Washington Institute, specializing in the military and security affairs of Iraq, Iran, and the Gulf states. He's also the co-founder of the Militia Spotlight platform, which offers analysis of developments related to Iran-backed militias in Iraq and Syria. Mike has also worked extensively with local military and security agencies on the ground in Iraq, the Gulf states, and Yemen. We are also joined by Zohar Palti. Zohar is the Viterbi International Fellow at the Washington Institute. He previously served as the head of the Policy and Political Military Bureau at Israel's Ministry of Defense, where he directed defense and security relationships with foreign countries. Prior to that, he led the Mossad Intelligence Directorate and served as the deputy head of the research division in the IDF Intelligence Corps at the rank of colonel. Our third guest is Dr. Patrick Clawson. He is the Morningstar Senior Fellow and Research Counselor at the Washington Institute. He also directs the Viterbi Program on Iran and U.S. policy here at the Washington Institute. Dr. Clawson is a leading Iran expert, and he was previously a senior research professor at the National Defense University's Institute for National Strategic Studies and a senior economist at the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. I want to thank the 3 of you for joining us on Decision Points. I want to thank you, Patrick, you, Mike, and you, Zohar. Thank you all very much.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks very much for having me on, David.
Thank you for inviting me, David.
Patrick, let me start with you. Can you give us some sense of the origins of the Ring of Fire concept? What does it mean? How was it developed? It's often attributed to Qasem Soleimani, the head of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, the IRGC, who was killed in a U.S. drone strike. What was the idea? Is it driven by ideology to make Israel unlivable, or is it driven by Tehran's more regional strategic interests?
Well, let's start with the implacable hostility that the Islamic Republic of Iran has towards Israel and the United States, and take that as a given, and then ask, what can Iran do about that? Well, Iran had a truly dreadful experience when it invaded Iraq and lost a lot of people and was really remarkably unsuccessful. And so that made Iranian leaders quite uninterested in the idea of attacking Israel directly. But on the other hand, the Iranian leaders thought that Israel was quite vulnerable because they felt that Israel was not a particularly stable society and that it would be quite possible to make Israel unlivable under the current system. And so, therefore, the approach of Israeli leaders for quite some time has been that, well, Israel is going to disappear, and let's just accelerate that process. So the Ring of Fire ideology is an ideology of how to accelerate that process, which is seen by Iranian leaders as inevitable. Israel disappearing, of Israelis becoming unwilling to live in the country. And this Ring of Fire then makes that all the more likely. And may I point out that there are some Israeli leaders who say similar things. That is to say that Iran developing nuclear weapons or that constant Iranian attacks on Israel will make it difficult for Israelis to continue to live in the country, and Israelis will slowly over time leave the place, and Israel will disappear as the kind of society it is today.
So would you say, Patrick, is a lot of this Soleimani himself? Was
No.
it his brainchild? Or is this Khomeini and continued with Khamenei? And Soleimani is just one kind of part of thinking that goes back to the start of the Islamic Republic in the late 70s.
Well, when the Islamic Republic started, I think there was much more optimism that it was going to be possible to have Islamic revolutions in a great many places. It's really after the Iran-Iraq war when Iran realizes there's more limitations to its power than it thought, and it was going to have to develop a different approach that Iran begins casting about for, okay, now what will we do? And under Khamenei, there has been, on the one hand, a great deal of sensitivity to how much the West, mostly the United States, but to some extent the West as a whole, including Israel, can undermine the Islamic Republic through what usually referred to in Iran as a velvet revolution, referring to what happened in Czechoslovakia, where the government fell extremely quickly. It went from being a very solid communist state to being, on the other hand, a Western ally. And there's this, Khamenei has for years said that the real danger to the Islamic Republic is Hollywood, not Washington. I truly love his speech about how miniskirts are more dangerous than tanks because they can confuse people. So there's been that sensitivity to the ideological attraction of the West. But on the other hand, there's been a great confidence that Iran can make life unbearable in Israel, and then Israeli Jews will leave. The current Israeli state will disappear.
So, but it's not a defensive thing like Iran, Israel doesn't accept us, so we don't accept them. It's ideologically. They feel there's no room for a Jewish state in the Middle East, right?
Well, it's a combination of revolutionary attitudes, of sort of left-wing Marxist attitudes of opposition to the existence of Israel as a colonial settler state. And then there's also nationalist ones of how can Iran expand its national power and take what many Iranians regard as their rightful place as a great country. After all, Iranian soldiers were invading Europe 2,500 years ago. The first marathon was to bring news of the desperate battle against the mighty Persian army invading Europe. So there's the national element also. And then there's the religious element, which is blatantly anti-Semitic. But it's not the only element. That's one component, but not the only component.
So how does Qasem Soleimani fit into this? What is his role? What makes him this unique figure in the Revolutionary Guard that is seen as someone who can mobilize? How would you describe him to people?
He was extremely good at translating these general ideas into practical realities. He was a genius at figuring out what had to be done in order to take these general ideas and put them into practice. And so he was very good at reaching out to others, figuring out who could have helped the most, coercing them into helping the most. and organizing their activities. He was a very charismatic individual and very good about execution. I am reminded of when the Bush administration was leaving office and who were asked, well, how do you think you did when you were in office? And Bush's response was, okay on our plans, but dreadful on our execution of plans. Well, Soleimani was the kind of guy who could execute plans that Iran had long had in general.
I mean, people say note that he was an Arabic speaker who liked to go to the field. I have to believe as in a Persian, given like Persian-Arab enmity, that he was able to bridge some of these differences across the divide, that he was able to reach some of these proxies in the Arab world in a way that maybe others could not.
He was also very effective at reaching out to people. So he was very good at identifying what it is that people wanted and speaking to them on a personal basis. Oh, he was a very personable kind of guy.
So explain to me, Hezbollah starts, before the end of the Iran-Iraq war. I mean, that's 1982, 83 with the Lebanon war. Each proxy is different. The Houthis are different. The Hezbollah in Iraq is different. How does he start to thinking about different proxies, different speeds?
Well, he's quite good at figuring out, okay, well, this is what I can accomplish with that group of people, and this is what I can accomplish with this group of people. And how do I work with this group of people differently than I would work with that group of people? So he was quite effective at figuring out, well, okay, how it is that Iran can mobilize Pakistani and Afghans to fight on behalf of Assad's regime in Syria during the Syrian civil war and complement what's available from Hezbollah so you don't put too much strain in Hezbollah. And he was really very effective at figuring out, okay, this is how we're going to get them in there and this is how we're going to use them most effectively. So he is, in fact, a master. He was a master at how do you make use of very different groups.
And what is the role of the supreme leader personally in this? I mean, we hear about he has a personal relationship with Hassan Nasrallah. He sees Nasrallah as a close confidant of Hezbollah. How would you assess his role, the supreme leader?
Well, the supreme leader is a micromanager and likes to have a great deal of control over whatever it is that happens. And he has not been willing to see anybody as his deputy. He's not been willing to name a successor. And he has encouraged many different institutions and many different individuals who have competing roles, each of whom think that they're in charge of an issue, but Khamenei's got various different people playing it. And Soleimani was in some ways an exception to this. Khamenei was prepared to see Soleimani have much more authority than almost anybody else. He was, in fact, in the last months of his life, Soleimani was playing a role in Iranian domestic affairs. So, for instance, there had been some very bad floods in southwestern Iran, and it was Soleimani and the Quds Force who were turned in order to provide relief when other parts of the government turned out to be utterly ineffective at doing it. Now, the Quds Force was supposed to be for external operations, and here was Soleimani and the Quds Force being used at home.
We keep hearing that, when there's economic hardships in Iran, that there have been protests sporadically that have complained about that too much money is going to proxy groups. And I'm just wondering, how does the supreme leader navigate the domestic public opinion, the economic hardships? Does this impact at all his support for these regional groups?
Not particularly, because the support for the regional groups is actually not that expensive, Hezbollah being somewhat of the exception. But the ability of the Iranian government to sustain its spending on these groups, even at times when Iran's income has been constrained considerably by low oil prices and lax conditions of the oil markets, has been quite impressive. So we've had some Iranian governments, some Iranian presidents who've wanted to rein in that spending so they could use the resources elsewhere. But that has been the exception and not the rule.
And one more question is just, you say he's a micromanager, and I'm trying to understand between the supreme leader and Qasem Soleimani or his successor, the issue of decision-making at the top in Tehran and how much autonomy do they give to these groups? How much decision-making comes from Tehran? If the Houthis stop shipping in the Suez Canal or anything like that, how much of it needs the sign-off of the Iranians? what is the role, the boundaries of kind of where Iran is influential, and at what point Iran steps back and said, okay, that's a local issue for you guys?
Well, that depends very much on different groups. So, for instance, the Houthis are famous for taking support where they can get it and not paying much attention to advice that they're given. So the Houthis are not going to take advice the same way, let's say, the various militias in Iraq do or Hezbollah does. But even with Nasrallah, whose relationship with Khamenei is the closest among the proxy groups, there's been a real Iranian understanding that when it comes to Lebanese domestic politics, Nasrallah has to be given a lot of room to make decisions about what to do. And Nasrallah has pushed back at times against the Iranians when it comes to domestic politics inside Lebanon. But when it comes to something which Nasrallah was clearly quite reluctant to do, namely send Hezbollah soldiers into Syria on a considerable scale to help the Assad regime, if Iran says you got to do that, Nasrallah's said, okay, guys, we got to do this.
And one more question on decision making. I had heard, after the killing of Ismail Haniyeh and also Fuad Shukr, and who's an advisor of Nasrallah in Lebanon, there was talk about maybe a joint Iran-Hezbollah reaction, but that the U.S. deployment in the Middle East was so massive that the Iranians were deterred and kind of told the Nasrallah, you're on your own, so to speak, and that actually influenced the scope of Hezbollah's reaction. I'm just wondering, to what extent do you find that U.S. deterrence against Iran could constrain Hezbollah's decision-making as you see it looking at Tehran?
Well, we do not know what's going inside Khamenei's mind, and I'm often skeptical about claims that are made about, well, that's the reason Iran did something, or that's the reason that Hezbollah did something. I'm not convinced that we know as much as we think we know. I suspect that people are making what seem like plausible guesses, but they are not necessarily backed up by solid information. And I have to say that Khamenei is generally quite a cautious guy. He wants to die in bed. And so he is at times backed off on things. There have been times, for instance, after the Taliban had killed a number of Iranians claimed to be diplomats, and there was a lot of support, including U.S. support, by the way, and support to the United Nations for Iran taking retaliatory actions against the Taliban, and the Iranians mobilized tens and tens of thousands of soldiers for an armed incursion into Afghanistan. Khamenei backed off. And it wasn't because of U.S. pressure. It was because of his evaluation of what might happen, how dangerous it might be. So this is not a guy who necessarily wants to rush into things. He, in fact, has been often quite cautious. So while he may be strategically pushing hard, tactically he can be quite cautious.
There's the story told that I think 2015 when Soleimani went to Moscow to get Russian support to prop up Bashar al-Assad with all the opposition to Bashar al-Assad, that he kind of said Iran will send its own troops, and they did not get the clearance from the supreme leader. And when Iranians kind of were dying in the battlefield, that the supreme leader brought a lot of them home. I don't know, is those stories accurate?
Well, it is certainly true that Iran put a lot of effort into mobilizing others who would do the fighting. I mentioned earlier the Afghan and Pakistanis who were recruited to do the fighting. And it is the case that Iran was quite sensitive to its Iranian casualties in Syria and quite hid them for quite some time. Now, I would read that as suggesting that Khamenei was indeed cautious about sending Iranian soldiers. But again, I don't think we have a clear understanding. I don't think we necessarily know that much. Don't forget that Iranians are not necessarily well loved in Arab countries, and sending Iranian soldiers into Syria might not have been the best way for Assad to proceed. So it's conceivable that Assad was reluctant to receive the Iranian soldiers as well.
All right, I want to move over now to Mike Knights, to make some order for us and understanding the different groups and the different relationships with Tehran. I'm thinking of Hezbollah, I'm thinking of the Houthis, I'm thinking of the Iranian proxies in Syria, the Khatib Hezbollah in Iraq. I mean, each one has got to have their own set of relationships with Iran, their own set of autonomy, their own set of goals. How ideological are they? How much is this part of the region? How much do they take orders from Iran and how much are they kind of go their own way? So, Mike, how do you see it?
What I'm going to do is to sketch out for you the Iran ring of fire, the axis of resistance. But I'm maybe going to do it in a way sort of from their perspective, particularly how they view Israel. Because each one of them has it adds strengths, but also vulnerabilities and exposures to Iran's threat network when it comes to Israel. So, when we look at the closest in, or rather, let's work from the way out, actually. Let's do that. Iran is 2,000 to 2,500 kilometers out, and we've seen that its own direct attacks on Israel have not really generated significant results. They could try harder, it could provide less warning. But the fact is, getting closer is valuable. It gives less warning time, and maybe the retaliation would fall somewhere other than Iran. So when we look the furthest out, we can see one of the newer members of the axis of resistance, the Houthis in Yemen. They're probably about 1,800 to 2,000 kilometers out, which is still a significant distance. They can land the odd blow in Israel, but they don't really have the mass firepower capabilities of Lebanese Hezbollah or the very advanced capabilities of the Iranians yet to be able to regularly get a missile or drone onto a target in Israel. We've seen it, obviously with Tel Aviv. They pulled off a stunt of being able to fly towards Tel Aviv from the west after flying over North Africa. But it's hard to repeat this stuff. Now, if you're the Houthis, you want to be at the forefront of the axis of resistance. You've been treated as nobodies in the middle of nowhere for a long time, with Lebanese Hezbollah getting all the attention, or the Iraqi militia groups. But in this war, since October 7th, the Houthis have really jumped to the front. And the way they've done that has not really been with their attacks on Israel, even though it's worth remembering that the Houthis were the first to ever fire a medium-range ballistic missile at Israel. Not Iran, but actually the Houthis.
Yeah, explain just to our audience for a second, because on their flag, they have death to America, death to Israel. Where does the animus of the Houthis even come from? I think a lot of our listeners would like to know.
The Houthi movement in the 1990s was already looking to Iran and Lebanese Hezbollah for an example. They basically wanted to do what Lebanese Hezbollah had done, to build a southern Hezbollah. And they sought Iranian and Lebanese Hezbollah support for that. But they also had a very strong connection in to Hamas, the Palestinian cause. And we saw that in particular when we had the Second Intifada. About that kind of period, we got a bunch of things coming together. 9/11 and the U.S. war against Al-Qaeda. We got the Second Intifada. And we got the real rising in the strength of the Houthi movement and the beginnings of their wars against the Yemeni government. So it got baked in at that point, the whole, death to Israel and Jews. It's something that they believe. They're probably more, I would say, ideologically connected to Hamas than any other part of the axis of resistance. They're committed in the same way that Hamas is really committed.
Do they know each other? Do they work together? Did they meet? Do we know they have mechanisms for coordination?
Well, there's not a lot of coordination, but just the other day, the Houthi leader, Abdul Malik al-Houthi, had a communication with the head of Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and they were expressing, a huge amount of mutual admiration for each other. It's more that Iran started to provide advanced weapons to Hamas and to the Houthis at about the same time, particularly more accurate drone systems. And in fact, Hamas and the Houthis got those more accurate drone systems before even the Iraqi militias backed by Iran did. And those Iraqi militias have been working with Iran since the very early days of the Islamic Revolution in Iran, same way that Lebanese Hezbollah did. So the Houthis and Hamas sort of jumped the queue a little bit. But, let's not get ahead of ourselves. Essentially, you have the Houthis sitting out there at long range from Israel, primarily serving its part in support of Hamas by internationalizing this conflict by attacking global shipping in the Red Sea, the Bab el-Mandeb, and the southern entrances to the Suez Canal. So they couldn't do a lot directly against Israel. Instead, what they did was to do stuff mostly indirectly against Israel. They do throw in harassing shots into Israel, some of which can be painful. And we saw the Israelis on July 20th burn down about a third of the Houthis' oil storage capability on the Red Sea coast in retaliation for that man getting killed in Tel Aviv by a Houthi drone.
So let me just ask you this, because Hezbollah, I think our listeners know, because we did a whole episode on Hezbollah, and our listeners follow the news carefully, but they don't know as well, I think, that the Iranian militias in Syria or the Iranian militias in Iraq. Could you give us a little context on those groups?
Yeah, so peeling the onion, the next range band in, as you get towards Israel, are the Iran-backed militias in Iraq and Syria. And, they're able to bring rockets or drones on Israel from ranges between sort of 300 and 1,000 kilometers. They can get pretty close because the west of Iraq extends pretty close to Israel. And because eastern Syria and going into central Syria, you're in the sort of 600 to 800 kilometer range band. So in those places, during the Iran-Iraq war in the 80s, a lot of Shia in Iraq, Shia Muslims, were radicalized by the Iranians to turn against Iraq, where they came from. So in other words, Iraqi Shia who were taken prisoner by the Iranians during the Iran-Iraq war, they would say, why are you fighting for the Sunnis in Iraq, for Saddam's government? We can help you overthrow him. We can help you go back and take over because you are the majority. And so in the 80s and the 90s, Iran built these factions. And then when we came in 2003 and removed Saddam, these factions essentially rode our coattails in and then started to take over the Iraqi government from within. And a somewhat similar process happened during the Syrian civil war, where again, Iran-backed militias, many Iraqis, some Syrian, started to take over big swathes of Syria, particularly eastern Syria. And now we're at the point where these groups cannot be told by the Assad regime or by the Iraqi government not to use those pieces of territory to fire drones and missiles towards Israel. So they're the next range band out, and they're quite useful addition to the Iranian arsenal, because the Iranians don't care if Israel starts bombing inside Iraq or eastern Syria. And the Americans find it a little bit uncomfortable because the US has still got troops in those places and it doesn't want to get drawn into Israeli bombings of local areas and how that could undermine our presence in those places. So that's the next level out.
And here, too, it seems like the Iranians use their influence with these weak governments to create safe havens for these militias, and they do often what they want, or do they act at the directive of the Iranians?
Well, this is what a lot of our work focuses on at the Washington Institute, particularly within our Militia Spotlight program, is understanding exactly what the relationships are between the Iranian handlers and their local partners. Some people call them proxies. And so, ultimately, if the Iranians want you to stop doing something or start doing something, and if you're one of these groups, I think whether it's the Houthis, whether it's the Iraqi groups or the Syrian groups, or even Lebanese Hezbollah, if the Iranians say, stop it, you tend to stop it. If the Iranians say, start, you tend to start. But there's a lot of room in the middle where the Iranians don't push it. They're not the sort of overlord that is constantly trying to micromanage you. In fact, they don't spend their coins of influence all the time because they're not stupid. And they also don't tell their partners to do things that are definitely against the interests of their partners. So they don't tell them go commit suicide, essentially. And as a result, they have a kind of a strong and durable relationship with these groups because when they do ask for something, they don't ask too often, and they wouldn't be asking if it wasn't important and in everybody's best interest within the axis of resistance. So the factions tend to listen to them. And, one of the things sitting behind that is the fact that Iran's where you get your advanced conventional weapons from. That's why you have drones, long-range rocket systems, missiles, and everything else, including this week, that's also probably why you have your pages, but that didn't work out so well.
I mean, I assume that they're, to the extent they have liaison, it's with the Al-Quds forces, with the Revolutionary Guards. And I don't know, if it's Soleimani, his successor, but I assume that's the nexus. Are there possible cracks here that are possible because of their own domestic concerns of these groups, internal factors, whether it's the distinct religious background of the Houthis, whether it's wanting more independence in decision-making, maybe there's some external pressures. Is there something that could threaten the cohesion of these groups and their alignment with Iran's broader regional strategy?
Yeah, that's what we're doing a lot of our work on at the Washington Institute of Militia Spotlight, it's really looking at exploitable gaps and fractures within the Iran threat network and how to put stress on the individual parts so they don't work so well together. Now, there's two ways of thinking about it. You can either find ways of bringing pressure on the lower levels of the system, like the Iraqi and Syrian militias, the Houthis, Lebanese Hezbollah, Hamas, West Bank, Palestinian groups. Or you can say, why not go straight to the head of the octopus instead of going for its tentacles? Like, for instance, if you want to stop the Houthis right now from attacking shipping in the Red Sea, you will probably get better results from telling the Iranians we're going to hold you directly responsible and hitting something in Iran. And that's a big step for any government, US, Israeli, whoever, to do. But it probably would be more effective than what we're doing at the moment, which is to hit the tentacles. And the Houthis are so pain insensitive. They're like the boxer Rocky. They could take any amount of hits. They block them all with their face and they keep going until the final bell. So, in that case, if you want to affect the Houthis, you've probably got to do it from the top down through the Iranians. But what we've also learned to do, for instance, with less tough opponents like the Iraqi and Syrian militias, we've learned to kill their leadership figures, and they tend to back off pretty quick when you do that. That's what happened, for instance, on June the 30th. The Biden administration was actually very robust in knocking on the head a sequence of escalation that was beginning against our US bases in Iraq by these Iraqi and Syrian militias. And we killed a couple of senior Iraqi, Houthi, and indeed wounded an Iranian inside Iraq. And that stopped that sequence dead. So we've learned how to deter the slightly wimpier versions of the, of the axis of resistance. With the Lebanese, it's, Zohar will be able to tell us all about how that issue is managed. And again, the Israelis have got inside their head very well, I think.
Well, that's a good segue over to Zohar. Zohar, listening to all this, to an average listener, this sounds so bewildering. They're used to countries they've heard of like Egypt and Jordan and Saudi Arabia. But, Houthis and Iraqi Hezbollah and Iran proxies in Syria, it sounds bewildering to many people. How do you see, as someone who spent your life in Israel's national security establishment, what do you see as the biggest challenges in countering Iran's proxy network?
The first thing is to understand the Iranian strategy that, frankly, they want, and they're declaring that they want to destroy and to eliminate the states of Israel. And following Patrick's explanation before regarding this strategy, what's new over here that is right now in two tracks. One is to gain and to build one day a military nuclear bomb. And that will be, of course, devastating if it will succeed eventually. And the second track that are working on it is the ring of fire and the conventional weapon system that are launching all over the states of Israel in the last year. And if I'm going all the way back to 82 and later on Second Lebanon War and on in between, meaning there is a full strategy over here from the Iranian regime. And what happened in the last year after the atrocity of October 7, and when we hear all the terrible things that Hamas used to do to kill 1,200 civilians, and of course to get into the villages and to kill and to rape our civilians, the first one that backed up Hamas and fought shoulder to shoulder with him since October 8 is all the proxies of Iran, leading by Iran. And basically Hezbollah immediately started, without any provocation from Israel, firing all over the north of Israel. And it's already 11 months like that. And since we finished most of the job in Gaza a couple of weeks ago, that's right now that we're shifting all the efforts in order to deal with the north of Israel and to take down Hezbollah. And that's what you heard in the last weeks. So Houthis are joining this party. And the Houthis started this, let's say, venture with them like 5-6 years ago. I have to give the credit to the Emiratis and to the Saudis that they have been the first one to notice the dangers of the Houthis. They opened the war. Sadly, the international community didn't back up them enough back then and push them in order to close this war. And the consequences to let the Houthis to grow up, we see those days, while they are paralyzing right now the maritime shipment all over the Mediterranean and the Red Sea. And of course, who is suffering is the Egyptians that right now have a huge economical problem because of the Houthis' activities. The other ones that joined the party is, of course, the Shia militias in Iraq. And from time to time, they are launching. Last night, they launched UAV against the states of Israel, and thank God we intercepted it. So right now, there is several fronts, all leading by the Iranian strategy against the state of Israel. They're the head of the octopus. And there was also another milestone, historical one, at the night of 14 April, last April, when the Iranian leader Khamenei, that he is no longer want to die in his bed and is no longer responsible, took a decision, a very strong one, in order to hit targets inside the states of Israel, again, without any provocation from us directly on Iran. And he launched 300 what we call air breathers, meaning surface-to-surface missiles, cruise missiles, UAVs, and thank God that all the good guys, mainly leading by the United States and CENTCOM and General Kurilla, with the Israelis, with other two superpowers like the British and the French, American technology, Israeli technology, outstanding performance, and we folded. Meaning we are in a very, very big historical junction right now, and we have to stop the Iranian into two tracks.
So Naftali Bennett, I realize he's not the only one who says this, but has often, and Mike Knights mentioned it, about likening Iran to the head of the octopus, believing that Israel needs to strike the head rather than all these proxies because Iran doesn't care if its proxies are being hit. Can you talk about that whole strategy? I mean, Israel has on times, maybe not taken credit, but there's been some drone factories inside Iran that have been hit. Israel has certainly hit the nuclear scientists, and that's a different story. That's the nuclear issue. But this whole issue of the relationship between Iran and its proxies, that Iran is happy if Israel is dealing with proxies because it's not dealing with the source. What are the considerations for Israel as it considers how to retaliate against these attacks?
First of all, it's true. Iran is the head of the octopus, and they're orchestrating the whole scene in the Middle East, how all the proxies are serving their course. But when Israel is looking about the global picture of Iran, first of all, we see the Iranian intention to get the nuclear bomb. And the priority is to foil these attacks. And thank God in the last 30 years, many, many good guys all over the world, and of course in the Middle East, are trying and so far succeeding to stop the Iranian in order to get it. And no doubt that if you're looking about the Israeli priorities, is first and foremost to prevent an existential threat. That's what happened in Iraq in 1981 with the nuclear reactor in Iraq. That was happened in September 2007 with the nuclear reactor in Syria, when Bashar started to deal with that. And I hope that we're not going to reach a point that we'll have to deal also with the Iranian. I think it's an international problem. This is a global problem. It's not a problem of what Israel is doing against Iran. I think it should be a joint effort. And God forbid, and I'm looking right now about all the development and all the balls in the air and the challenges that the Americans are facing right now in Southeast Asia and Europe. And of course, what's happening in the Middle East since October 7. Imagine to yourself, God forbid, that the Iranian will have the umbrella of the nuclear bomb. How the Iranian will react over here in the Middle East. What will be the implication on the Saudis? What will be the implication on the Emiratis? What will be the implication on Egypt and Turkey, with all the Sunni wards that immediately will have to balance it? Now, it's not right now that the Israelis are trying to say, hey guys, we have a problem over here. Everybody have to understand Iran is bad guys and things like that. We're in the reality already. It started in the last year. Israel right now is in the edge of the spear. They're taking all the heat. But in 5 minutes from now, it can be completely all over the Middle East. Completely. And the most important issue for the Shia is to topple the regime, the Sunni regime, the moderate in the Gulf. The two gentlemen that right now is with me is much more expert than me in these issues. But if you're coming to the Arab states, the moderate one that used to do the Abraham Accords with us and the peace with us, and you speak with them, the first priority is the fact that they are really afraid from the radical regime in Tehran. And they understand exactly what the head should be concerned about. And that should be a global offer. But then again, if things come to shove over here, and eventually we'll have to face these challenges alone, sadly I'm saying it, we know how to do it. But we prefer to do it with the help of the United States of America. And so far, this administration, the Biden administration, have done an amazing job in the last year, sending and supporting us in an outstanding way. Twice he sent 2 carrier in the nuclear sub, and so many forces over here to tell the Iranians whatever President Biden used to say, don't. And sadly, they didn't listen in April 14th. And I hope that I'm not going to do the same mistake, because next time it's probably not going to be only defense. We have all the good guys, also some offensive capabilities that we haven't used them yet.
Given your background, I'm sure I'm not going to put you in a difficult position by asking you to respond to this incredible development over the beepers, pagers when it comes to Hezbollah, but it has raised the question, if there is a war coming with Hezbollah, the Biden administration seems to think that a war with Hezbollah is going to lead to a full-scale regional conflict. Do you think there's a way to address Hezbollah or the other proxies without a full-scale conflict? Can you isolate these proxies as you fight them? And Hezbollah is the strongest, and so I think, and that's where the development is, in a way that does not lead to a regional war in your mind.
So we'll have to wait and see. We are already in the event. It seems to me that this question is relevant for 3 days ago, and that's why I will be hesitating and careful to give you an answer, because we're on the verge of a full scale already. We'll have to wait and see in the couple of next hours, days, whether we are in the slippery slope. Hezbollah in the last year, as I said before, without any provocation of us, decided to stand alone with the terrorist organization of Hamas, shoulder to shoulder. In the last year, we gave so much room and place, mainly to the mediators and mainly to Amos Hochstein, to try to get a deal. Enough is enough. Almost a year that we have something like 70 to 80,000 people out of their houses in the north. We don't have any intention. We used not to have any intention to go back to Lebanon after 17, 18 years that we spent there. But it seems to me that Hezbollah dragged us to a point that right now, as I said, enough is enough. And we're going to, right now, as a state, we're going to turn the clock to the other side. And if needed, we will go inside Lebanon and we'll have a buffer zone in Lebanon. And if needed, in Hezbollah, we provoke us and challenge us. It seems to me that we are already, as I said, in escalation mode. Would I like to see it not happening? The answer is definitely yes. But in order to that, we need mainly the Europeans, the German and the French, that have a lot of leverage over here. They need to go to Beirut and to explain to the Lebanese guys, you're already a failed state, you don't have economy, you don't have electricity, and it's not because of the Israelis. And it seems to me that we can prevent it. But the mode of Tehran and the mode of Beirut, it seems to me it's in another place already.
So you don't rule out it could lead to something regional. You think that de-escalation is still a possibility if the international system mobilizes in time, correct?
Exactly. And time, I'm meaning in a couple of hours from now, a couple of days from now. It's not a weeks, because we're already right now in the event.
So let me just ask you one last question, because you alluded to this, Zohar, which is the issue of the Saudis, the Emiratis, and clearly what the United States has wanted to do was to promote Saudi-Israeli normalization as part of a regional integration policy, and that would create almost an anti-Iran alliance. I know the term is loaded and we have to be careful. It means different things to different people. And you said that, that for these countries, they're more worried about the destabilizing impact of Iran than they even are about the nuclear dimension, because they don't think they'll be the target of Iranian nukes. But how much do you think, if the Saudis and the Israelis could find common ground? And I want to ask this and conclude the program with each of our guests on this. To what extent, and I'll start with you, Zohar, and then go to Mike and Patrick. To what extent, if there is a Saudi-Israeli normalization, could it work to cut down the influence, the destabilizing impact of these proxy forces?
So I would say something like that. Based on the experience we have with the Egyptians and the Jordanians and the Emiratis and the Bahrainis and the Moroccans, I would say something like that. If we will have a peace, a normalization with the Saudis, that's the biggest achievement since the peace with, since we started the process with the peace with Egypt. Saudi is the biggest country in the region. It's so important country that will be huge, and that will be a great achievement to the states of Israel to integrate in the area, in the neighborhood. I think it would be also great to the Saudis, and we can do some great things together with all the other partners over here regarding so many issues, from climate change till high-tech companies and how to develop the region. I don't want to see, and this is not the aim of the Israeli, to see a peace with the Saudis, to be against something, even if it's Iran. We want to start it with the right approach and the right vibes, meaning peace is coming between people, between the Israelis and the Saudis, and I think it will help tremendously also to solve some of the problem with the Palestinians over here. We need the Saudis aboard, and it's not against Iran. Israel know how to deal with Iran, and Israel have outstanding friends like the United States of America. I don't want to change into the verse if there will be a peace with us and the Saudis just because of the Iranian that we're working hand to hand with them. This is not the right approach based on my understanding as Israeli. On the contrary, we want to do it because we want to do it with the Saudis, and in a very open-minded and very open-hearted, and I think it would be a great idea, and I hope that any administration that will be in America in November will take it as the most important challenge. And it's so important after October 7 that the Saudi will join to show the region whatever is doing terrorism and things like that, the answer is with peace.
I want to ask this last question to my other colleagues, to Mike, and then to Patrick. Give Patrick the last word. But Mike, do you think if there is a Saudi-Israeli rapprochement, that this could have an impact on the whole proxy network, on the Ring of Fire?
Yes, I mean, it's no coincidence that we were getting close and October 7th happened. I really believe that. There was an aspect to that even if the order didn't come from Iran, the proxies themselves knew that they were on the edge of a disaster, particularly those closest to Israel, such as Hamas and Hezbollah. I finally just say that it takes a network to defeat a network. We always look at the Iran threat network and we marvel at how they built this network. But, if we think about Israel's defense against the Iranian attack on April the 13th, it was a network that defeated that attack. And that network involved Saudi Arabia, it involved Jordan. Also, to me, the rings of fire are sort of concentric rings, as I've said. And the most dangerous rings are those closest in. Well, it's great that there is no Jordanian ring of fire yet.
There are no Sunni proxies in the same way that there are Shia proxies, it seems.
Yeah, but it's just great that peace over the years and normalization has meant that at this moment, Israel didn't have to worry about being attacked from Egypt or from Jordan. It made this more manageable. And as this normalization process continues, it's going to get harder for the Iran-backed axis of resistance to land really serious blows in Israel. I'm not triumphal, but I'll say this. In the last 9 months, I think the Iran threat network has really struggled to maintain and sustain deterrence against Israel. The balance of power and the sort of balance of terror, I think, has swung to some extent in Israel's direction. And if we get normalization, it'll swing further. You'll get better air defenses and missile defenses across the entire region in greater depth that the Israelis can support and could tap into, the significant coffers of the Arab states. And with the Americans acting as a kind of glue within that system, you've got a very robust potential defensive network. And look at just as a final thought, the axis of resistance powers, generally speaking, they're broken countries, broken economies. They're not stable and they're not growing. That's not the case for the axis that's being produced when you bring together the Gulf states, Israel, and the United States. So I'm hopeful about the future.
Well, good. Do you share the optimism, Patrick?
The Iranian leadership is very good at interpreting whatever happens in ways that make them look good and to make Iran look good. And so I have considerable pessimism that Iran will interpret Israeli-Saudi relationships as somehow showing that they were correct all along. And so while I would agree with my colleagues that an Israeli-Saudi normalization would have quite a dramatic impact on much of the Middle East, I'm afraid that the decision makers in Tehran will be less impressed by it and will press on with their views and be sure that this just shows that their policies of when slap back harder are the right ones. Now, I think that an Israeli-Saudi rapprochement will reduce Iran's ability to slap back harder. But I am afraid that Iran's leaders will not necessarily agree and will not necessarily change direction in ways that we like because of such a rapprochement. Indeed, I could imagine the Iranians using such a rapprochement as an argument as to why, well, it turns out that we actually do need nuclear weapons and that we need to reconsider our pledge not to develop nuclear weapons. It would not in the least surprise me if at some point in the near future, Iran's leadership says, well, that fatwa about Khamenei issued about nuclear weapons, that's been overtaken by events.
But Patrick, will they use their proxy network to thwart a rapprochement? Is that within the ability of Iran to do so? Because we did hear that they've said on the Abraham Accords, we could have thwarted it, but we decided not to, so long as Israel doesn't have a military facility, right on our border.
The best way to describe that statement about thwarting the Abraham Accords is complete nonsense. And the fact is that Iran does not have the capability of thwarting a rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Israel because of the nature of Saudi and Israeli politics and their approaches. And I don't think that the Iranians are going to say that we're going to thwart it because I think they realize that they can't. And they don't want to make themselves look weak and helpless by saying we're going to do something which they then can't do.
So basically, for all the power of these proxies, they are not strong enough to thwart a massive diplomatic effort in the Middle East by the United States.
Correct. Or a massive diplomatic effort in the Middle East by the countries of the Middle East. This is not just the United States. This is also a decision by the Saudis and the Israelis.
Right, exactly. So I think that's an optimistic way, an upbeat way to end here, is that we know that how Iran has tried to unleash them, these proxies, but there are limitations on their abilities. And when the United States, the Gulf, Israel are united, these responses will be constrained. So I really want to thank all three of you for joining us and really illuminating this whole murky area of proxies and its relationship to Iran. As it comes to confrontation with Israel, I want to thank you all three for joining us on Decision Points. Thank you very much. We just had a timely discussion with Patrick Clawson, Mike Knights, and Zohar Palti on the issues of the day, namely Iran's relationship to the proxies and how this is impacting also the Gaza war. As Zohar mentioned, Israel's at a critical historical junction, facing a multi-front challenge orchestrated by Tehran, the head of the octopus, so to speak. While the world focuses on the immediate security concerns, the broader implications of Iran's actions for regional stability are important and they're undeniable. The key question moving forward is, how can we leverage the moment, we in the United States and the international community, so that somehow war turns into increased regional stability? As the events of April 13th and 14th demonstrated, it will take a coalition of international actors, whether it's the United States, France, Gulf countries, Jordan, working together with Israel to determine whether this regional escalation deepens or whether there is a path towards de-escalation and whether that path can be found. This is a big question facing us all. I want to thank all of our listeners for joining us on another episode of Decision Points. Thank you to my dedicated team of research assistants at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. I want to thank Rena Gaber, Simone Sadmeyer, Sydney Hilbush, and Gabriel Epstein. I also want to thank Rob, Hadia, and the production team at Podville Media, and listeners like you for making this podcast possible. Please leave us a 5-star review so we can continue to grow this community. Subscribe to Decision Points on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Acast, or wherever you get your podcasts. To our listeners from all over the world, thank you for listening to this season of Decision Points.